Hi, this is Pat Johnson, and in this mini lecture, we're going to talk about how psychologists ask and answer questions. In other words, how psychologists do research. One of the things that my students ask me in my seated classes is, why do we have to learn about doing research at all in psychology? In other words, isn't it all just common sense? And I answer them by saying it's often common sense in hindsight. In other words, when we hear about a psychological principle, it makes sense because we can immediately apply it to our life. But we do need to learn how research is done because a lot of things need research because they contradict each other. And let me give you an example of two statements that contradict each other, and we would have to use research to try to tease out what the actual truth is. So, you've all heard the term probably, absence makes the heart grow fonder, that old saying. In other words, if somebody that we love is away from us, we will think about them and we will forget their faults and love them even more when they're not around. But you've also probably heard out of sight, out of mind. In other words, when somebody isn't around us, we tend to forget about them. So which of these is true? They're both statements that we hear often, and in psychology we could actually do research and find out which statement is truer. So in psychology, we usually start out with a theory. In other words, we've made some observations and we've come up with an idea about how different factors are related to each other. For example, I have noticed over the years that students who don't show up to class very often tend to get lower grades. And I could transform that theory into a hypothesis. In other words, a hypothesis is just a theory that we can test. It's a formal statement showing the relationship between variables in our theory. So I could have an example such as students with many absences earn lower grades. That's a hypothesis that we could test. Another hypothesis could be wisdom increases in old age. Both of these are statements that we could test. Now, I immediately usually have students ask me, wait a second, what do you mean by wisdom? And I come back and say, what do I mean by wisdom? And also, what do I mean by old age? And even backing it up a bit, what do I mean by an absence? And how much lower grades? What we're getting at here are we need in our hypothesis to form operational definitions for our terms. And our operational definition just means putting our term in a way such that it could be measured. So an operational definition means we make our terms measurable. For example, you might define absent as a student who isn't there for 100% of the class. Or you could give an operational definition for absent as a student who isn't there for 75% of the class. And somebody else would say, no, if they miss 50% of the class, they're counted as absent. Well, which one of those is correct? And a psychologist would say, all of them could be correct as long as you say, and I defined absent as, let's say we go with 50%. So in your research you would say, my operational definition of being absent is 50%. Now, how could we form an operational definition of old? How old is old? If we're going to say wisdom increases in old age, what do we mean by old age? And some of you might say, well, anybody over 30. And some of you would say, nah, that's still young. Anybody over 60. Notice that I gave an age older than I am right now. Quite a bit older. Somebody might say, no, old is anything over 50. And then I'd get a little huffy because I'm over 50. So any of these could be correct. 75. As long as you say in your research, and my operational definition of old is whatever you define it as. A harder word to give an operational definition of would be something like wisdom. What is wisdom? And I have students argue about that all the time. What do we mean by wisdom? So again, in this little mini lecture, we talked about forming hypotheses, which are theories that we can test, and then stating our terms and giving operational definitions for those terms. And an operational definition just means that it is measurable. And that's the end of this mini lecture.